The knock at the door sounded ordinary, the kind that makes you glance toward the living room and wonder who would show up unannounced. William and Virginia Bucher were at home in Henrico County when a young man asked to use their phone, claiming car trouble. He spoke calmly, like someone with a small problem and nowhere else to turn. But the moment the door was open, the calm disappeared. A pistol came up. The man forced his way inside and signaled to someone outside to follow. It was March 12, 1979, and Richmond was about to learn how quickly a quiet night could become a crime scene. The intruders were members of the Briley group. Linwood and Anthony Briley were there, and Duncan Meekins was involved as the house was controlled and the victims were restrained. The men moved with the confidence of offenders who believed they could do whatever they wanted and walk away. The Buchers were tied up, the home was robbed, and then the offenders tried to erase the evidence and the witnesses at the same time. They splashed kerosene through the house, and, as they left, a lit match was tossed onto the fuel. The only reason the Buchers survived was because their bindings weren't tight enough. William worked his hands free, then Virginia's, and the couple ran out of the house as smoke began to build. They made it into open air just before the fire took hold in earnest. When responders arrived, they saw a burning home and two shaken residents describing a gun, forced entry, and attackers who seemed completely unhurried. For detectives, the case began as robbery and arson with attempted murder. For neighbors, it planted a fear that lingered because the offenders had walked right up to a front door and turned a routine act of kindness into a trap. The Briley brothers were not strangers to trouble. Linwood Earl, Briley, and his younger brothers, James Dyrell, J.B., Briley Jr., and Anthony Ray Briley, had grown up in Richmond and already showed a capacity for violence. In 1979, they escalated into a spree of robberies, assaults, rapes, and killings that struck without a consistent victim profile. Sometimes they wanted money or property. Sometimes they seemed to want the feeling of control more than the haul. Meekins moved with them during parts of the spree, and his later cooperation would become central to how police reconstructed what happened. As spring moved into summer, the brothers kept looking for chances to take what they wanted. Some nights, they prowled for someone alone. Other times, they created the opening themselves, using a weapon to make compliance feel like the only option. Cases came in across the city as separate tragedies, and families compared details, how fast it happened, how little the offenders seemed to care, who heard or saw. Detectives began to notice overlaps, but the public still struggled to see one story. It felt like the violence could appear anywhere, and the uncertainty made it worse. That shifting violence reached John Gallagher, a Richmond disc jockey performing at a South Richmond nightclub. Between sets, he stepped outside for a break. The Brileys had been searching for a target and decided he was it. He was assaulted and forced into the trunk of his own Lincoln Continental. They drove him to the ruins of a paper mill on Mayo Island in the James River, pulled him out, and shot him in the head at close range. His body was dumped into the river and found 2 days later. The theft was almost insultingly small compared to the life taken, and when the brothers were later arrested, Linwood was still wearing a ring taken from Gallagher's hand. By early fall, the violence hardened into something the city could no longer treat as isolated. On September 30th, 1979, 62-year-old private nurse Mary Wilfong returned to her Richmond apartment. The Brileys followed her to her door, surrounded her, and Linwood beat her to death with a baseball bat. It was a killing at arm's length, carried out with blunt force, and it showed how comfortable they had become with brutality, how little effort they needed to decide that a stranger would not be allowed to live. That same night, the brothers moved toward a small home on Barton Avenue. Inside were Frank Wilkerson, his partner Judy Diane Barton, 8 months pregnant, and Barton's 5-year-old son, Harvey Wayne Barton. When Wilkerson noticed men outside, he shut and locked the door. It was the instinctive move of someone who sensed danger, a tiny attempt to keep the threat outside. But the men came directly to the entrance, and Wilkerson, afraid of what would happen if he refused, let them in. The home invasion unfolded with practiced speed. Wilkerson and Barton were overpowered, bound, and gagged with duct tape. Judy Barton was raped while the others were restrained nearby, unable to stop it. Afterward, the attackers covered their victims with sheets, then decided they could not leave witnesses behind. Meekins later described being pushed toward participation, told he had to get one. Wilkerson was shot in the head. Judy Barton was shot and killed. Her son, Harvey, was also shot and killed. Police were in the general vicinity that night and later saw men running down the street at high speed, but they didn't know where the shots had come from. The bodies were not discovered until 3 days later, turning the delay into its own kind of cruelty for the families and the investigators. When the Barton Avenue killings came to light, Richmond's fear became something sharper. People checked windows twice before sleeping and watched strangers longer in parking lots and stairwells. Detectives worked the case with urgency, searching for connections that could turn scattered violence into a single investigation. The break came when Meekins, facing serious charges and the possibility of death, accepted a plea agreement and began to talk. He described who was present, how victims were approached, what was said inside the homes, and how quickly decisions were made to kill. His cooperation tightened the timeline and gave investigators a roadmap that matched physical evidence and witness accounts. The Briley brothers were arrested soon after the Barton Avenue murders. In court, the spree was laid out as a sequence of deliberate choices. The Bukers bound while their house was set to burn, Gallagher abducted and executed, Wilfong beaten at her doorway, and a family trapped in their own home. The charges piled up: murder, rape, robbery, and firearms offenses, and jurors heard enough detail to understand the scale of what the city had been living through. Linwood Briley and J.B. Briley were sentenced to death. Anthony Briley received a life sentence. Even after conviction, the story kept one last surge of fear. In May 1984, Linwood and J.B. were among 6 inmates who escaped from Virginia's death row at Mecklenburg Correctional Center, sparking a statewide manhunt and renewed anxiety in Richmond. They were recaptured within weeks and returned to custody. Linwood was executed in the electric chair on October 12, 1984. J.B. was executed on April 18, 1985. Richmond remembered 1979, not just for the number of victims, but for the way the spree invaded ordinary routines. A knock at the door, a man stepping outside between sets, a nurse walking up to her apartment, a family locking a door and still losing everything. The Briley brothers didn't just kill, they made a city feel exposed in its most familiar places. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.